Welcome back. Now, the #1 story of the week. The Biden administration says federal agencies can lift limits on the number of employees agencies allow in the workplace. Agencies have to turn in their return to office plans by July 19th. Those plans could affect the entire federal property strategy. Norman Dong is managing director at FD Stonewater. He served as commissioner of the Public Building Service at the General Services Administration under President Obama. Dan Mathews is head of federal sales at WeWork. He served as commissioner of the PBS at GSA for President Trump. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks very much for joining me. Norm, I ask you first, what's your takeaway from what we're thinking about or should be thinking about, not just 6 months from now, but 2 years from now and 5 years from now about the federal real estate footprint?
I think the consensus that we're hearing as we hear from agencies on this topic is that, life is going to be different as we emerge from the pandemic. We will see an increase in telework and remote work, probably not at the levels that we saw during the height of the pandemic, but we're not going back to 2019 either. And I think the principle here is that we really should be designing for the future and not for the moment. And as we think about what agencies will need in the future, it really is not going to be one size fits all. We're going to see this question about telework and remote work vary by agency mission and by function and by position. And I think you saw that reflected in the OMB guidance that was released yesterday.
Dan, welcome. Thanks very much for coming on the program as well. What does that designing for the future look like, both from the GSA perspective in what resources and tools it needs to provide for agencies, and from the agency perspective itself? Everybody that I've talked to says what Norm just said, which is one size won't fit all, but how does an agency determine what size fits it?
It's a great question. I think the short answer to it is it's going to take some time. And so if there was one word that I would use to describe the federal real estate portfolio post-COVID, it's going to be uncertainty. Uncertainty in terms of when people are going to be working, where they're going to be working, how they'll be working, and how much space the federal government ultimately is going to need for federal office space. That's going to be a big question. It's going to evolve over time. They're not going to know initially. OMB, OPM, and GSA put out a memorandum just yesterday on return to the office. There was an interesting line in there about tracking utilization of facilities and office space. They're going to be encouraging that to build that data so that they have some insight into what the actual need will be over time. But with that uncertainty, the tool that the government really needs to lean on at this point is increased flexibility. Federal real estate, for the most part, is a pretty inflexible, capital-intensive endeavor. And they need to inject some additional flexibility, additional tools, so that as they reduce their footprint, not knowing exactly what they're going to need, a certain portion of that footprint should be obtained through more flexible type of arrangements that allow them to get in and get out quickly without massive capital expenditures or long-term liabilities.
Norman, what are the implications of that for GSA in particular and the kinds of deals that it does both in owning and leasing space?
I think as we emerge from the pandemic, you're going to see some rethinking of conventional wisdom. And as Dan was just describing, agencies still face considerable uncertainty, and they're still trying to figure things out. And it's important to maintain some flexibility. And we saw that in some recent guidance from GSA in terms of lease term strategy. The conventional wisdom over the past decade or so has been go for that longer term to be able to capitalize on favorable leasing rates that we're seeing in many markets. That's being slightly recalibrated now, given the uncertainty that we're seeing as we deal with and as we emerge from the pandemic. So GSA has recently come out with some guidance that really kind of stratifies the thinking a little bit in terms of, all right, when you see that you've got a long-term requirement and you know what the space and facilities needs are for that requirement, and that's often true for like specialized space for like land ports of entry or courthouses or national security functions. So when you clearly understand what you'll need for the long term, then go for that long-term lease term strategy to be able to capitalize on the better financing and the better rates that you see with that longer term commitment. That having been said, there are other functions where folks are still trying to kind of figure things out, and there's less certainty about what's required for the longer term. And in that case, what GSA is advising to do is to go for something that's shorter, probably around the 4 to 6 year time frame, to be able to kind of sort through that uncertainty and to better map out an agency's requirements for the longer term.
Dan, you mentioned the uncertainty, and I think you're right on that. Given what Norm just laid out there, do you think there's a period of time that agencies kind of need to get their thoughts or strategies together in order to figure out what, to try to gain some certainty? Or does the flexibility that you're suggesting give agency, if GSA is able to deliver to that, does that give the agencies the flexibility they need to take their time and really think through what their needs are going to be in the out years and not try to come up with something for the short term?
It's a great question, Francis, and I think it really comes to the key issue, which is a tremendous risk for the federal government. I think all things being equal, having uncertainty and indecision about what the future may hold may lead some agencies to try and do nothing, just hold on to what they have until they figure it out. But the reality is the federal office portfolio is much larger than they need right now. And a strategy of holding on to what you have while you wait to figure it out over the next 2-3 years is going to cost hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars for effectively empty buildings or largely empty buildings. That's not a good strategy, and it's a high risk for GSA because agencies could turn back space to GSA. So that's where they really, if I were sitting in that job right now, I'd be looking at the core portfolio, meaning what you own and what you lease in traditional lease terms. And I'd be looking to reduce those two rather significantly. So when leases expire, allow some of those leases to expire, then try and bring additional flexibility and other types of products into the portfolio that allow them to scale up or down to deal with that uncertainty. And I would really urge agencies to look to the private sector. Smart companies, they have the same issue, right? They're dealing with these same questions and they're saving money now. They're making decisions now while they are learning over the next year or two what it's going to look like so they can plan for the long term. But there are strategies they can use and they should turn to the private sector to try and figure out how to reduce, save now while they're making those decisions, as opposed to just holding onto everything while they figure it out. That will be a very expensive proposition.
Dan Mathews and Norman Dong, thanks very much. I appreciate your time today.
Francis, thank
you
for
Francis.
the opportunity.